launch for the new website finally coming in about a month. Anyways, let's switch back to JavaScript on WordPress. I'm really excited to get started, so go take it ahead.
All right. Yeah! Woohoo! All right, before I get rolling, I just have to plug Front-End Masters for one more second because Mark and the team here has done some amazing stuff, and me coming to be here is a huge honor because some of the instructors that they have on this site are the top-notch people out there writing books, lecturing, talking about JavaScript in super depth. So if you haven't checked out their other courses and stuff, I highly suggest it. It'll take any level of JavaScript you have and go way, way deeper. So that said, way to go, y'all. Front-End Masters, where it's at. Now, this JavaScript for WordPress workshop is a little bit interesting because we're coming to WordPress from a very unconventional avenue, which is from the world of JavaScript. So we've already gone through, hopefully everybody has everything set up that we need. So I wanted to start off just talking about why as a JavaScript developer or why as a developer we should care much about WordPress. And I don't have my notes here, but we're gonna make this work. So first of all, if you don't know what WordPress is, it's a content management system, which means that it lets you edit and manage your data. It could manage media, anything from videos to audio to pictures. It could deal with posts and pages, and it can also deal with custom content. So you could set up your own thing like projects or events, and you could set up your own custom fields to have whatever conditions you want. It's also very extendable. So it has two kind of directions of extendability. You have themes, which controls how all the content looks, and then you have plugins, which extend the functionality of WordPress itself. Now, traditionally, all of this was done in PHP, and WordPress is built on a very open source stack, but that is shifting a lot. As a developer that knows JavaScript, you have a huge win in the world of WordPress because it's becoming more and more JavaScript driven, but not as many people in the WordPress space, even experienced developers, know JavaScript. So if you have some of that foundation and you learn just a little bit of WordPress, you're already much further ahead than a lot of other folks. So that's one of the main benefits coming into this. The other is that if you're building applications out there, WordPress can offer a lot in terms of taking care of a lot of what you would maybe call like the application framework or foundational stuff. Handling login, handling user credentials, handling user roles, managing the content, having the database synced up, having an API available. So if you're rolling your own, that's going to be quite a lot of work, and it may be something helpful there. So that's kind of the two areas of why, as a JavaScript and general developer, it's helpful to know about WordPress, especially in the time we're at now. So historically, WordPress developers have lived in a bubble, just like a lot of us live in bubbles. And this bubble has been a very safe place for learning how to develop. Some of the top WordPress plugin and theme developers out there learned everything they know about web development from WordPress. You could learn HTML, CSS, PHP, and JavaScript all at a very easy barrier to entry. Now, this is shifting in big part because, like I'll talk about, WordPress recently added an API to its core, that now the WordPress bubble is kind of intercepting with this much larger JavaScript bubble. And there's a lot more that you could do with JavaScript and server-side that might not work with WordPress, and just the sheer number of people developing JavaScript apps. I don't know the actual pure numbers. WordPress powers a huge portion of the internet, but the JavaScript development world is a huge one. So WordPress developers are coming out of this. In the past, they could know just a little bit of jQuery and get by for years with everything that they needed to. But now we're needing to learn things like frameworks like Vue and React and tools like Webpack and Grunt and Command Line and NPM and Yarn and all that. So this is shifting for them. And for those people who already know these skills in the JavaScript world, like I said, it's a great way to come into the WordPress space, both for work and for leveraging what WordPress can do for you. So WordPress was forked from another free version of blogging software in the early 2000s. and it has had a very interesting history of JavaScript in it. So there's this talk that I'll share the link out later. In fact, should I just throw this in the chat? Well, no. Search for his name and then JavaScript past, present, and future. This is a 15-minute flash talk. And he starts off at the very beginning talking about the 300 lines of JavaScript that were in one file when they started. And now 30% or somewhere around there of WordPress is built in JavaScript. So over that time, we've seen a lot of different little admin features added, making this a little bit easier, starting off with like adding some buttons and then TinyMCE eventually, which is JavaScript driven. And then some bigger things were implemented. We have things like the customizer, which is the first single-page web app experience built inside WordPress. And it lets you change all these features like menus and widgets. It doesn't edit the content directly, but your site name, and you could swap out themes and things like that and see all of it live and preview. So this is a single web page experience, and it's not using any major frameworks behind the scenes. It has its own JavaScript API and is pretty powerful. So this was added in time. We have other features like, wait for it, it's so worth it. The media library, so a pretty robust media library where you could drag and drop images, you can move stuff around easily, you could just drag stuff into the browser and it will load, and not just images, but videos, other things as well. It has some embed technology, so you could just paste a YouTube link in there and it'll automatically reform it into a embedded URL. So this was built in Backbone. And at the time, a lot of decision went into, or a lot of thinking went into making that decision of, what framework should be used, and it allowed a lot of things to be done that weren't able to be done before. Also, because it's in core, it was used for other projects. So we also have things like post revisions, which is a way to basically scroll along a bar and see left and right differences between different posts. So if you have an about page and you've edited it over the course of a year and changed things, you could just drag something and see the two previews side by side of the differences. Again, moving more into that like single page web app experience. So there is stuff in WordPress core that uses JavaScript, and it's increasing more and more. One of the biggest things that's come out lately is a product called Calypso. And so Calypso is built on React. It's completely a single page web app design. And not only does it rebuild the entire admin area of WordPress in JavaScript and React, but it also has other abilities like checking stats, letting you manage multiple blogs all in one place, letting you track and read other people's blogs all from one admin area. And so Calypso was put out by the folks at Automattic. And this is where, if you're not as familiar with WordPress, it's important to make a distinction. There's something called WordPress.org, which is the open source version of WordPress that we're working with today and that you could download and run on your site or run locally. And then you have WordPress.com, which is a hosted version of WordPress, free to use but paid features. And this is run by a company, Automattic. So Automattic has contributors that work full-time on WordPress, but also on Calypso. So now there are people whose jobs are just to support the software. Now you cannot easily just take Calypso as this new admin interface and run it in a .org installation. It's really set up for the .com environment, and it's doing some things like some node interactions that you cannot do on a traditional WordPress server because it's PHP based. But this is a pretty big move because right after the API became available to do this stuff, this was dropped and made quite a splash. I'm a pretty big fan of it. I try to use WordPress.com on some of my projects just so I can stay exposed to these things. And one of the nice things about it is because it's JavaScript based, it's not hard to roll out a desktop version of it and mobile versions for Android and iPhone that are all native, but are also running on the same rough JavaScript base. So The influence of Calypso should not be underestimated, even though I'd say the majority of WordPress users and people, unless you're on .com, they don't use it. They're not contributing to it. But because you have such a big company that has such a big influence on the future and direction, the fact that this big software that is used in production and is based on React has some influencing power on the JavaScript world today. So stepping back from this a moment, in 2015, in December, Matt Mullenweg, who is kind of the co-founder of WordPress, he was one of the two people, along with Mike Little, who forked it back in its early days. He gave his first homework assignment ever, and every year he gives a talk on the state of WordPress and what's latest and greatest, what's coming, what's new, all of this. And at the end of 2015, he gave his first homework assignment, which was learn JavaScript deeply. Now, on a personal note, I haven't shared much about myself, but my background is in education and web development, so I've taught high school and college and code schools and online schools, and now I'm here at Front-End Masters. It was funny because I was let go from a job the exact same week that he said this. They're like, oh, we don't want to teach WordPress anymore. So I'm like, what am I going to do? And I show up at this talk, and he's like, go learn JavaScript deeply. Everybody, go learn it. And so I was like, okay, I'll be teaching JavaScript deeply now. And I have ever since I was sitting in the audience for this. So that's kind of a little bit just about me and what my focus has been on since then. I started a project called the JavaScript for WordPress Master Course. And it's gone through different revisions. I was planning to just take 4 months, teach JavaScript from start to finish, and then take off for the rest of the year. And now, like a year and a half later, I'm halfway done with the project because JavaScript from start to finish is a lot. The next year, at the next state of WordPress, he said the same thing again. Go learn JavaScript deeply. And the reason for this is becoming more and more apparent. He also pointed out that 30% at that point of JavaScript or WordPress is in JavaScript. It's core code. So to contribute to parts of it, you need to know it. But there's also more stuff going on since then. So that customizer I showed you, it's getting better and better. There are experiments on how to do more and more with it, as well as widgets and hooks in WordPress are a huge, huge part of it, but you've had to build all of them in PHP. So there are some projects now. The way new features in core and WordPress work is they launch it as a plugin first, get all the traction, get all the testing done, then it becomes a featured plugin, and then eventually rolled into core. So these other projects that I'm mentioning here have a lot of work behind them and people going into them, but they're not in core yet. So this is just kind of what's up and coming. And then the biggest one is Gutenberg. And Gutenberg is a rebuild of the entire editor page. So when you go to add a post or add a page, it's going to be rebuilding that as a single page web app design with the ability to kind of drag some things around, have blocks of content instead of just one content field. And in order to build it or work with it, you're going to have to know JavaScript. And there are some debates right now. It's, I wouldn't say too out of control, but there is a lot of influence on people saying, oh, we should build these new things in React because Calypso is built in React, and we have all these developers being paid to work on a WordPress project that's already in React. But then you have so many of the average developers out there who've really fallen in love with Vue, and they're like, no, Vue's easier, and we should use Vue instead. And so there's a lot of discussion going into this right now, and they even have open chats every week, and you could join them if you wanted to and take part of the discussion. So this is kind of some of the stuff that's coming up in core. And the point being, a year from now, these things will be even further along, and to edit and work with any of them, in the past you could use just a little bit of PHP. Now you're really going to need to understand your JavaScript. And in the real world, we're seeing this as well. So plugins building out more API support. So if you have a contact form, it's not going to work with an API-powered site unless you do some extra work behind the scenes. We're also seeing more JS-driven themes. It's still, at this point, not always the smartest idea to build your entire theme in JavaScript because you lose out all the ability of WordPress, like feeding you data and loading stuff on the page. And we'll even see some stuff today on where it's a good approach to, hey, let's just do this with PHP, but we'll take over everything else with JavaScript, because there are still some cases of that. So I say JS-driven. And then one of the most exciting is completely decoupled environments. So you could build your React or Angular or Vue app and then just tie into the APN on the back end and never have to touch WordPress. And with authentication, you don't actually have to log in. Although I will say that Where it's at right now, even decoupled projects, most people are saying if I have a client that needs to regularly edit content, let's let them log into WordPress normally to do that. But we want to build our apps in Angular or in JavaScript or in Vue right now, so we're going to build it that way because that's the future, and we'll just plug into the back end with the API, and they could go and edit it that way. So this is kind of the current landscape of JavaScript and WordPress. And what's fascinating to me, and having all of you here, is that this is the very first time, I think, in WordPress's history where we're seeing people with JavaScript experience or dev experience in mass beginning to look at the software in a completely different way than the average person who just knows some PHP and can build a theme. They're not coming in going, oh, how do I set up my Webpack build, and how do I build a decoupled project and tie into an API, because these skills are not standard, but in a lot of education now with web development, this is stuff that's being taught kind of as the go-to way. So there is discussion on what's going to come next. I have some opinions. It hasn't really been announced, so I'll hold them off, but possibly even by the time this airs, or definitely within the next year or so. We'll probably see, just like Backbone was added and jQuery was added at a certain time, we'll probably see Vue or React added to WordPress core itself and the core components being built with that, which is going to allow a lot of other things to happen easier. So just to note and to remind, to kind of wrap this up, that JavaScript is becoming more and more integrated and more important to WordPress. So having these skills is essential. And it's a buzz in the community, and has been for a little while, of people trying to learn more. So I want to push again, if you have these skills on the JavaScript end, jump into doing more with WordPress, because there's a lot of folks that could use your expertise, and clients that could use your skills too, right? So that's just a little general outline about introduction to JavaScript in WordPress. Now, we don't have time today to get into how to work with every core feature. So what we're going to talk about first is the process of what WordPress calls enqueuing. So this is basically getting your JavaScript into a theme, and you don't just put it in your footer and hard code it. You have to actually load it through some PHP code. So we're going to walk through the different ways that you could do that, some of the tricks around it, some of the different things that you may or may not know about with that. And then, of course, we'll shift from there to talking about plugins. It's pretty much the same process, but it's just enough difference that it is important to mention. And of course, when you have a plugin, you could run JavaScript anywhere in the admin area. So if you want a plugin that hijacks the edit pages and loads your own custom JavaScript, you could do that. Now, in both of these examples, we don't have time today to teach JavaScript. So I'm going to give you code examples that are already fully coded with the JavaScript, and there'll just be some core things missing or wrong with them. And you'll have to go in and do that. And I pick things that you're most likely to have to copy, paste, and change next time, right? So if you have one project and you're like, oh, I need to do that again, you're going to have to copy this block of code, you're going to have to put it here, change these 3 things, and then you can write the rest of it. So all the examples today are really built around that, and I hope that that's helpful. I will say, depending on your JavaScript level, the examples do get more complex as we go on, so you may end up getting to a point where you're like, I don't know what is happening, but it's working, and that's awesome. And you could take these and play around with them, and I hope that if you have projects or explore this more, that you'll be able to use those as kind of jumping off points. Then we got to talk briefly about Ajax. We're shifting away from relying so heavy on Ajax in WordPress, and we're moving more to, I guess you could still say it's Ajax, but API-driven Ajax instead of custom PHP functions that you're writing that are returning a certain request. But it's a little funky, so we do have to look at it. So we'll look at how to do that in WordPress. And that's going to be kind of where we break. So this is what I'd call the more traditional WordPress JavaScript. And then we'll shift in the afternoon into getting into the WordPress API-driven stuff. And that's kind of the more modern take on it. So from there, we'll look at all the different endpoints and what comes out of the box, what you might expect to see customized. And then we'll go back to our themes and plugins, and we'll say, okay, if we're in a theme or a plugin, how can we pull in the API and use it just piecemeal or completely? And then if we're decoupled from WordPress, so if we're launching on a completely different server somewhere else, nowhere connected to WordPress, how do we pull in posts? How do we pull in pages? How do we authenticate and save data and stuff like that? So these last 2 projects, what we'll be building is something that will list all of our posts in JavaScript, give us a single page view of them, and also allow us to log in and add posts, edit posts, and delete them. So we're not rebuilding everything. You're not going to be able to edit categories or add featured images and things like that. But from this foundation, it should be a pretty good jumping off point, especially if you have some comfort with APIs. Any questions at this point in terms of course outline, what we got going on, what's coming down the road for us today? JavaScript. Okay, let's get going. Enqueuing JavaScript. Enqueuing JavaScript is the process of loading it onto a theme or into the admin area using PHP functions. Okay? So the PHP that we're going to use primarily comes down to these two functions. So WP-enqueue script is going to be what we actually set up, and that will load our JavaScript behind the scenes into our theme dynamically. So that's great. Then we're going to kind of hack or hijack something that was not intended for what we're using it for. But WP localized script, because WordPress runs in so many different languages, and it's really big on being translatable, easily translatable, and easy to run in other languages, and easy for other people to translate, WP localized script was meant so that you can pass different versions of words, or you could pass different languages, so localizing the language or information into your JavaScript. So this process we hijack because there are times we want to take PHP data or stuff that WordPress has, and we want to load it and make it available in our JavaScript without having to use the API, right? So if you have a PHP file and it has some data, how do you get it to talk to that JavaScript? You could load it into the DOM and then pull it out of the DOM and use it that way, but you could also inject it directly, and we'll look at that process. So this is what enqueue script looks like. It takes a few different parameters, and I have them broken down line by line. So the first parameter that we have is a unique handle name, and we can name this whatever we want. Commonly, it'll be something like theme-js or my theme this, or like view-js if we're loading Vue or something like that. So this first one is something that you want to be able to at a glance look at and tell what it is. And then in other places, if you ever want to say like, hey, pass this extra data into this file, you'll call it by that name. The next parameter is the path to the actual file itself. And so there are a few different ways to dynamically get a file. So in WordPress, if you have a theme, all of your theme files are going to be at like yoursite.com/wp-content/theme/name of your theme /assets/js/file.js, right? But you do not want to hard code that whole thing, because what happens if your theme name changed? What happens if they installed another site? Like all of these other things. So get style sheet directory URI is going to give us a shortcut to get into that folder and then be at the root of our theme folder. And from there, we could say, hey, go into our assets.js file and grab that file. So pretty straightforward. The other really cool feature that enqueue has is dependencies. So normally when we load JavaScript the old school way and we put one script tag and then another script tag and then another, we know that that order matters, right? If we try to put jQuery or Vue at the bottom of it and call jQuery stuff before that's loaded, we have issues, right? So what this handles, because in WordPress we're not going to be able to hard code anything, it can set up dependencies this way. So let's imagine I had two scripts. I had my helper script and I had my theme script. If this was my theme script where it says dependency handles, I could say handles-js, and it will automatically make sure that my handles one comes before my theme one. And we'll use this quite a lot. The other one we're actually going to avoid most of the time, and this is a great feature, but it's really annoying in development. So WordPress will cache all your CSS and JavaScript files. And one of the ways it does this is by adding a version number onto it. So if you put in here, I'm on version 1 of my JavaScript file, and I save a bunch of changes in my JavaScript file, you won't see those changes necessarily show up on your site unless you clear your cache. But if you change the version to 1.2, then it'll pull it in, right? Does this make sense? Head nods? Yeah? So we're going to cheat this a little bit, and instead of passing in a version number, we're going to pass in a timestamp down to the seconds. So this means that every time WordPress loads a page, we have dynamically put in a new version number that's just like a second or a few seconds off, so it won't cache it so that we don't have to clear our cache as we're developing. But once you're done, You don't want that to happen because you want your JavaScript running as fast as possible, right? So the very last thing is something that we usually leave to true, and it's a Boolean of true or false, and it just tells WordPress whether you want to load your JavaScript in the footer if it's true, and it's by default true, and you could set false, and it'll put it in the header. So WordPress has two hooks that we'll look at one point as we get into here. It has a hook called WP head and WP footer, and behind the scenes, it feeds everything in here. So if a theme is missing WP head, it'll break a lot, and if it's missing a tag in PHP called WP footer, that's how it injects everything in the right place. So that's the enqueue script, pretty straightforward, and we will look at this so many times today that if this is not making sense now, it will be literally second nature by the time we get out of here, along with this other one called localized script. So like I said, what localized script was intended to do originally was take different versions of a language or take different versions of a word and pass it in. You could pass it in Spanish, you could pass it in French, and swap it out dynamically on the front end. But what we're going to do is hack it to pass in some valuable data that we'll need for interacting with our WordPress site. So just like the other one, it takes the, it takes the handle of the file that we enqueued. So before, if we named our file when we were enqueuing it theme-js, we put theme-js here to let it know what to load. The next one is the name of the variable we want to attach all the values to in our JavaScript. So when we run this, there's going to be a global variable like window.name4js will be a variable. We could just run it in the console and get the value. So this is a good thing and kind of a bad thing. It's going to be made, publicly available, or not publicly on the page, but you could access it. But it's great for our scripts because if there's stuff we need to figure out from WordPress, like for example, we want to figure out the name of or the URL of our site. This is dynamic content that could potentially change. How do we figure that out? What about the name of it or the description of our site? All of these are things that someone can change on a whim, on the fly. So these are the type of things that we can pass in. And this is all PHP. I'm not really going to get into the details of what this is doing, but you could take a look at it and guess, hey, this top one is going to give me some sort of sanitized version of the URL to my site. And then the bottom one's going to give me the name of my site. Right? We could figure out that much. That's about as much as we need to know about this. And I'll give you the exact data we need to pass in at different times, but this is the other major thing that we do need to know about. So between localized script and WP enqueue scripts, that's going to be where all the magic happens. Last little bit. Like I said, WordPress needs to take these things that we set up. So take our JavaScript file, port it into the back-end magical caverns of WordPress, and then dump it out onto the page at the right time. And the way we do that is by hooking into WordPress's action and hook system. So where we see WP enqueue scripts here under Add Actions, this is telling WordPress, hey, at this exact time, when you're about to load all the scripts onto the page, whether it's CSS or JavaScript, go ahead and run my script too. So WordPress is chugging along, it's building out your page, it's got the head stuff, it's getting close down to the footer now, and then it's going to see this and say, hey, I've got to include this enqueue script, and I've got to localize it and pass it some custom data. Bless you. So these few things together are what we're going to work on with our first few exercises and getting comfortable with this stuff. So just to kind of review, what we're going to do here is we're going to focus first on just enqueuing regular JavaScript. That first step of just getting a file to load on the page. Then we're going to look at how to do multiple files, like I said, the helper and the theme, and how to make one dependent on another, and what happens when you switch that dependency. And then we need to talk a little bit about my friend HeyQuery, because there's a little bit of stuff we have to do different when working with jQuery, especially because jQuery assumes that the $sign is just for jQuery. But y'all know $sign is used in a lot of different libraries. So we have to do what's called a no conflict wrapper to make sure that we know, hey, this really is jQuery in this instance, and there's some stuff we'll do with that. The other cool thing that we'll realize is that WordPress includes jQuery bundled in its core. So anything that WordPress uses as a JavaScript library, we can access with our own code. So things like Masonry, jQuery, Backbone, Underscore, just to name a few. There's some like Thickbox and Lightbox stuff. since WordPress uses these, we don't have to go and get our own script. And in fact, it's a bad idea to load your own jQuery or load anything that WordPress is already loading. There's also an issue when we have external JavaScript. So you're familiar with loading stuff from a CDN, for example. The problem is that if WordPress attaches a version number to the end of a CDN URL, so let's say we're going to mycdn/view, and then it decides to add $v equals 4.1, that very well could break the URL and it won't load. So I got to show you a little bit of code that you'll need to use if you're pulling stuff down off of a CDN directly, if you're doing that for some reason. There's also some times where you don't want your JavaScript to load on every page. So for example, if you're building a custom project section or custom portfolio section and you want that to be a React app, you don't want your React app loading every single page. You just want it loading on that page. So I'm going to show you some conditional code that will let you say, hey, I just want my JavaScript to show up here, and then that's going to make everything else around it more performant. And finally, we'll throw in that localized scripts at the end, pass in some custom data. Okay? Let me pause again and see if there are any questions up to this point. And what we'll do next is swap over to exercises, and it'll all become more clear as we type. But if there are any questions or thoughts you have at this point, I can field those. All right, y'all ready to code? Okay. Let me switch gears here. Let's see. Oh, a few links for you. I will post up these slides so that you could have them, but this is just to the straight docs. You don't need this to do what we're about to do, but if you want to take it further, WordPress is pretty well documented. Oddly, it has a codex and a developer site, so it's kind of in the weird place of having two documentations, but for most of the stuff where you see developer.wordpress.org, that's the newer stuff, and when you see codex in the URL, it's going to be a little bit older, but it might not necessarily be outdated, is kind of the tricky thing. So again, these are the practice exercises that we're going to do, and let's swap over. Hopefully at this point, everybody has pulled down the repo that we have. And if you go to just github.com/zgordon, it'll be pinned as the front-end masters JS for WP. And we want to be looking in this first section here for enqueuing JavaScript in a theme. So before we get into exactly how we're going to do all these, just something about all of our project exercises to start off, and I'll show you in the code editor. This might be a little bit easier. Okay, so all of our exercises have two parts. They have the actual exercise that you should be playing with, and then it has completed. And completed is going to, of course, have the finished code. So the other thing that they have is a README file in every one. So if you can, on your computer, pop open this folder and come down into 1.1 enqueuing.js and open up the README. You'll see these instructions. So every folder that we're working with has this README, and then it'll tell you, hey, go to this folder, find this function, change this information. And when you go into that folder, or into that file, I'm sorry, and you scroll down, you'll see these comments that match the exact same thing as the instruction. So it says, change path to assets theme.js. So like I said, I'm going to give you some broken code and then give you the exact code to fix it. And the idea is to make this as easy as possible so that what we're really trying to do is identify the stuff that you're going to have to change regularly and not spend our day coding out or typing out a bunch of stuff that we don't need to. So again, you'll scroll through, you'll see where those changes are, and that's how you're going to follow them. Now, some of these exercises are themes and some are plugins. Everything we're looking at in this first section is a theme. So in order to run a theme, we can't just edit this here and have it magically show up in WordPress. We have to find the right folder on our computer and put all of these exercises into that themes folder. So if you're using desktop server or local, or I'm using another one, chassis, they're all going to be in different places depending on where you are. So let's take a moment now, just make sure that you can pull up your WordPress files, go into wp-content/themes, and copy and paste all of these exercises 1, so 1.1 through 1.6, copy and paste them into your themes folder.
Including the completed.
Including the completed, yep. Because then they'll all be there for you to edit and play around with. So like I said, mine's a little bit, oops, don't delete the whole folder. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to take all these files, copy and paste them in, and we're good to go. Now, if you come over to your WordPress site that you should have set up, it's whatever the URL structure you set up, go into your themes section, and you should see all of those themes there. And I'll just pull mine up real quick. If you're not familiar with WordPress, to log in, you could just go into yoursite.com/wp-admin, and that will take you to the admin area. You want to come into Appearance over here and Themes, and then you should see all of the themes listed there. Now, they don't have beautiful pictures everywhere. Let me refresh that. And what you want to do is activate 1.1, not the completed, but the practice one. And when you come over and view your site, nothing special should necessarily be happening. This is just a very basic WordPress theme that I have set up for you. So because this is the first exercise together, and we're going to be using this theme consistently through everything, I just want to show you a few different pieces of it. So the tricky thing we have to do now is, again, we don't want to be editing these files that we downloaded, right, from the repo. We want to be editing the files that are in our theme directory. So what I tend to do is just open up my whole themes folder inside my code editor. And today I'll be using Atom just because it's a simple one, but if you have a preferred IDE or something else that you like, don't change for my sake, keep using what you're using. But now go ahead and pull all those theme files into your editor so that we can see them all at once. And before we start with the actual exercise, let me show you a few things about this file. So WordPress, if you haven't built a theme before, this is about as simple file architecture as you're going to find. Index.php is loading and controlling every page there is. Hold on a second, I can make this bigger. How's that? Is that more legible slightly for the files?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit? Okay. So index.php is going to control all the pages. Header will have our header code. And if I open up header, remember how I said there's a file called, or a function called wp-head? Notice that there's no JavaScript and CSS here in our file. There's not even a title tag. This is the hook that WordPress uses behind the scenes to export any CSS and any HTML that we want to go in the header. And if we open up our footer.php, we'll see a WP footer. And again, this is the tag that WordPress uses so that whenever we include something that's going to go in the footer, it's going to dump out here. And when you run WordPress, you'll see in the footer, just WordPress alone is going to have a bunch of code there, and that's how it's hooking into it. Our functions.php file is kind of all the programmy stuff that isn't template code. It all gets thrown into a functions.php file till it gets too big and then taken out as a plugin or something like that, or separate other files. So that's just to give you an idea of the different files to expect. And then inside of our assets and JS, there is, most of the time we're going to be calling it theme.js. This is not a convention necessarily by any means. You don't have to call it that. You can call it whatever you want. And notice that it's just going to display a message. If you haven't seen these immediately evoked functions before, is this new to anybody offhand, the syntax? Nope, okay. What this is going to do is help scope our stuff and protect it from being put up into the global scope, and then it will load it. But the other reason I did this is later when we get to jQuery, we also have to use a syntax like this to pass in the $sign. So when our code eventually runs, all we're going to get is a console message that says loaded. So that's what we want to get to. And if we open up our README, we'll see the instructions. So since this is the first exercise, why don't we do it by ourselves, or I'm sorry, together, and then from here you could do the next couple exercises on your own, and then I'll circle back and go over them with everyone. So open up the functions.php file is the first step. I'm going to split my screen so I can keep my instructions up. And locate the WP in Q script function inside of JS for WP in Q scripts. Okay. So here is my JS for WP in Q scripts. And the instruction is to change path to file JS to assets JS theme. And that makes sense, right? If we look in our structure, we're here in our functions. We want to go into our assets JS theme and load it. Perfect. OK. So come down to where we have path to file.js. And we're going to change that to assets/js/theme. Honestly, if you all want to copy and paste this stuff up here down below, I don't really care. Again, the exercise isn't to type it out manually. It's to identify again and again the stuff that you're going to be changing. So once you do this, come back over to your site. Were there any other instructions? Let's see. Activate the theme, load it in the browser, look for loaded in the message console. So if I come back over to my site and I pop open my console, there we go. I'm seeing loaded. So what I'll do now is I will pause at this point, and you can go through the rest of the exercises yourselves. Now, I will say there's stuff in there I haven't explained yet, OK? But it's all documented, and it should make sense if you understand basic conditional statements and some programming. But keep your questions in mind. Jot them down, put them in a file as we go, and then I'll circle back and go over it all and answer them together, OK? So let's take about 10, 15 minutes and see how far we get through with all of these, and then we'll go from there. Like I said, it's not too much typing, and if you want to just copy and paste the things into the right places, completely valid. All right?
How many minutes do you want to take for this?
Let's see where we get with about 10 or so. Is that OK?
I'm guessing people will need help with getting set up with their first exercise, getting the files in the right directory and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, also the repo is kind of large to download too.
It is. I'm about to apologize for that. There's like several instances of TinyMCE in there, so 100,000 files. Sorry about that.
Yeah, is there any way we could put the production, builds of TinyMCE instead of the development at some point?
Definitely at some